Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be tackling a pretty, well, I don't know about pretty, but a heavy topic, that's for sure. We're going to be looking at how authoritarian leaders, how they seize power, and then once they have it, how they hold on to it.
Right, the million-dollar question.
It really is, and we're going to be looking at this through the lens of two very different leaders. On the surface, at least, Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba. We're using this, actually a really interesting history podcast I was listening to as a jumping off point.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it's a good one. But I should say right off the bat, this isn't going to be a history lecture. We're not going to get bogged down in all the dates and details. What we really want to do is understand the underlying mechanics of how authoritarianism works. Kind of like, what are the common threads?
Right, like looking past the specifics and into the DNA of these regimes.
Exactly. And to help us do that, we're turning to the work of political scientist Juan Linz. Have you heard of him?
Oh, yeah. Linz is like, if you want to understand authoritarianism, he's your guy. He's got this framework, and it's brilliant because it really helps you see, like, the skeletal structure of how these regimes operate.
Okay, so like X-ray vision into the heart of authoritarianism. I like it. So break it down for us. What does Linz say makes an authoritarian regime? What should we be looking for?
Well, he lays out these 4 key characteristics, almost like a checklist for spotting authoritarianism in the wild.
Ooh, I like a good checklist.
Okay, so number 1, and this one's a biggie,
Right.
imagine a one-party state, right, where political competition is basically non-existent. No rival parties, no real elections, just one single, all-powerful entity calling the shots.
So the very definition of a monopoly on power.
Precisely. And that right there is where you see a fundamental break from democratic values, right? Democracies, they thrive on diverse voices, on the ability to challenge and debate those in power.
Yeah, you need that back and forth.
Right. Authoritarian regimes, they can't stand that kind of stuff. They see it as a threat, a weakness.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's number 1 on Linz's authoritarian checklist. No competition allowed. What's next?
All right, number 2 is a little more insidious. It's the manipulation of emotions, often by creating or exaggerating threats.
Oh, so we're talking propaganda, fear-mongering, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Think powerful propaganda machines, fiery speeches that tap into people's deepest fears and anxieties.
Because fear is a powerful motivator.
Oh, it's incredibly powerful, and authoritarian leaders are masters at using it to their advantage, creating that us versus them mentality, a sense of constant threat that makes people crave a strong leader who promises protection, stability.
It's a tale as old as time, sadly. Create an enemy even if you have to invent one and then swoop in as the savior. Okay, so you've got the one-party state, we've got the fear factor. What's number 3 on Linz's list?
Number 3 is the one that really sends chills down my spine, and that's the ruthless suppression of any form of opposition.
So we're talking imprisonment, exile, even violence.
All of the above. These regimes understand that even a whisper of dissent, no matter how small or disorganized, it represents a crack in their facade of absolute power. And even a single crack can bring down an entire building, so they react swiftly and brutally.
It's a stark reminder that power, especially unchecked power, can corrupt even the most idealistic movements. Okay, so we're 3 for 3 on Linz's authoritarian checklist. No competition, manipulation through fear, and crushing any form of dissent. What's the final characteristic?
This one might surprise you. It's the lack of clarity when it comes to how power actually functions.
Wait, really? You'd think an authoritarian leader would want everything clearly defined? Rules, structures, a hierarchy?
Right, it seems counterintuitive, but this vagueness, this constant shifting of the goalposts, it's a feature, not a bug, of authoritarianism.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. Tell me more about this.
Well, think about it. When the rules are murky and always subject to change, it creates an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. It becomes almost impossible to challenge the regime through legal means, let alone overthrow it, because you never really know what the rules are or who to trust.
So it's like playing a game where the rules are constantly changing, and the only way to win is not to play at all.
Exactly. It's a recipe for power consolidation at its most insidious.
Okay, so we've got Linz's framework, our authoritarian X-ray vision, firmly planted in our minds. Now let's test it out on our first case study, Hitler's Germany. One thing that really struck me in that podcast was the sheer speed at which Hitler was able to transform Germany from, a flawed but still functioning democracy into a full-blown one-party state.
Oh, absolutely. The speed is remarkable, and it all starts with this one piece of legislation, the Enabling Act of 1933. It's kind of ironic in a terrifying way that this law, which essentially handed Hitler dictatorial powers, was actually passed by the German parliament.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Right. It's a perfect example of how authoritarianism often takes root not through brute force, at least not initially, but through manipulation, through seemingly legal means. The Enabling Act, it basically gave Hitler the power to enact laws without the consent of Parliament. He could do whatever he wanted.
And he didn't waste any time. I mean, 1933, the same year he passes the Enabling Act, he also outlaws all other political parties. Just like that.
Gone. Poof.
Imagine if, in the space of a few months, the entire U.S. political system was completely overturned. It's just mind-boggling, the speed and the audacity of it all.
And that, my friend, is a textbook example of Linz's first characteristic in action, the elimination of political competition. With the stroke of a pen, Hitler removed any possibility of legal challenge or dissent.
And it wasn't just about legal maneuvers, right? I mean, Hitler, he was a master propagandist. He understood the power of tapping into people's emotions, their fears.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master manipulator.
Yeah. The podcast talks about this whole concept of Lebensraum, this idea that Germany was destined to expand its territory, even if it meant violence, displacement, conquering other nations.
Ah, yes, Lebensraum, the living space doctrine. It was this potent cocktail of nationalism, historical grievance, and outright fear-mongering.
All the good stuff.
Right. All designed to tap into the anxieties of post-World War I Germany, this sense of national humiliation, economic hardship.
So create the external enemy, this need for expansion to solidify your internal control. Classic.
Exactly. By painting this picture of us versus them, of Germany being wronged, being surrounded by enemies, Hitler was able to silence internal opposition.
And any voices that did rise up in opposition were met with, well, let's just say Hitler wasn't known for his gentle approach.
No, not at all.
The podcast doesn't shy away from the brutal methods used to eliminate dissent. The Night of the Long Knives, the Gestapo, all designed to instill terror and crush any whisper of opposition.
These weren't just isolated incidents of violence. They were calculated tools of control. The Night of the Long Knives, for example, that was a purge of Hitler's own party, the Nazis.
Wait, he was killing his own people.
Even those within his inner circle weren't safe if they were perceived as a threat in any way. It was a message. Cross me, and this is what happens.
It's chilling. It's like this constant atmosphere of fear, of suspicion becomes the operating system of the entire regime.
Yeah, and that's the thing about authoritarianism. It really does make you question, how could humanity sink to such depths? But, we could spend a whole other deep dive unpacking that one. For now, let's shift gears geographically and look at our second case study, Castro's Cuba.
Okay, yeah, from the frying pan into the fire, right?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, obviously, Castro was no saint, but it's completely different context, right? We were talking about a revolution, not a beer hall push. Yeah, beer hall push, that's the one. But you're right. Very different historical circumstances, but as the podcast points out, the playbook, at least when it came to consolidating power, it's got some eerie similarities.
Right, like that whole silencing rival groups thing, establishing a one-party state.
Exactly. I mean, for Hitler, it was all about tapping into those economic anxieties, that nationalist fervor. Castro, on the other hand, he harnessed the energy of anti-imperialism, particularly against the United States, to really legitimize his grip on power.
Right, so it's the same us versus them playbook, just with a different villain.
Exactly. Castro, he brilliantly positioned himself as the defender of Cuba against this big, bad, interfering neighbor to the north.
And the U.S. didn't exactly help themselves with that whole Bay of Pigs fiasco, did they?
Talk about playing right into his hands. The failed invasion, it was a propaganda gift for Castro.
Oh, I bet.
It only solidified his image as the David standing up to the American Goliath. And he really played it for all it was worth. He used that event, and then later the Cuban Missile Crisis, to further centralize his power and really crack down on any remaining dissent.
Speaking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I have to admit that's one of those historical events that I know is a big deal, but if you asked me to explain it, I'd probably draw blank.
Well, you're not alone there. It gets pretty complex.
The podcast didn't go into too much detail, but they did make this interesting point about how Castro used that whole incredibly tense standoff with the U.S., I mean, we were on the brink of nuclear war to his advantage.
Well, absolutely. It's a perfect illustration of how authoritarian leaders, they exploit external threats, whether those threats are real or imagined, to consolidate their power.
Right, because if the nation is under attack, who has time for dissenting voices?
Exactly. Castro, he knew that by presenting himself as the only one who could guide Cuba through this existential threat, well, it allowed him to silence any internal critics.
And it's not like he was above using some, shall we say, creative methods to silence those critics. The podcast mentioned these neighborhood watch groups, the CDRs. Have you heard of these?
Oh yeah, the CDRs, those were, well, let's just say they were very effective at what they did.
Which was?
Surveillance and control. It was classic authoritarianism 101. Control the information, control the narrative, and eliminate any space for dissent to take root.
So it wasn't even just about going after known dissidents. It was about creating this atmosphere where people were afraid to even speak their minds, even in private.
Exactly. Self-censorship becomes the norm because you never know who's listening, who's watching, who's reporting back.
It's kind of chilling when you think about it, your own neighbor watching your every move. Okay, so we're seeing some, let's just say some unsettling parallels between Hitler and Castro, despite the vast differences in their ideologies, the whole fascist versus communist thing, and the circumstances of their rise.
Right, and this is where Linz's framework, those 4 characteristics, it becomes so valuable. It's like it helps us see past the superficial differences and into the underlying mechanics of how authoritarianism works.
Right. It's about recognizing those patterns. Okay, so let's loop back to Linz for a second, specifically that last point he made about authoritarian regimes often thriving on a lack of clarity when it comes to, power structures, like who is actually calling the shots. You said this actually works in their favor.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? You'd think a strong leader would want clear lines of authority, a well-defined hierarchy.
Right, like this is my job, this is your job, these are the rules.
Right, but in reality, that kind of clarity, it can actually work against an authoritarian leader. Remember, in Hitler's Germany, there wasn't a formal constitution after the Enabling Act.
So basically, it was Hitler's way or the highway.
Pretty much. And then you add in this whole idea of the Führer principle, which basically means leader principle. And it's this idea that the leader's instinct, his gut feeling, is infallible. So imagine trying to challenge a system where the rules are basically whatever the leader says they are at any given moment.
Yeah, good luck arguing with that in court, but the Führer's gut told him to do it.
Exactly. And then you look at Castro's Cuba, and it's a similar story, although maybe a little less explicitly tied to one person's gut feelings.
So it was more like a collective gut feeling.
Well, not exactly. I mean, Castro was definitely the figurehead, the ultimate authority. But the inner workings of his government, they could be pretty opaque. Like roles shifted, power dynamics were fluid, which again made it incredibly difficult for anyone to challenge his authority, even people within the government.
So in both cases, this lack of clear rules, clear structures, it actually strengthened the leader's grip on power. Which is like a really unsettling thought when you stop and think about it. It's like sometimes the absence of rules can be just as dangerous, maybe even more dangerous than the presence of unjust ones. This makes me think, and I don't know if this is too much of a what-if scenario, but could things have been different? Like if there were clear rules or a really solid constitution in both cases, could that have been enough to stop things from spinning so far out of control? Or were there just too many other factors at play, like were the societal anxieties so deep, so raw, that even the best constitution in the world wouldn't have mattered?
Ooh, that's a big question. It's the kind of question that historians could debate endlessly and probably have. It's tempting to play the what-if game with history, but the truth is, it's just too complicated for easy answers.
Right, like too many variables.
Exactly. Could a strong constitution have made a difference? Maybe. Or maybe the pull of a charismatic leader, someone promising to restore order in a time of chaos and uncertainty, maybe that would have been too strong to resist, even with the best of intentions. And we have to remember, intention isn't magic, even with the best constitution. You need people in power who want to uphold it, not subvert it.
Which takes us back to that whole power corrupts thing.
It's a tale as old as time, unfortunately.
It really is. Okay, so I'm feeling a little, I don't know, maybe a little disillusioned right now. Like, are we just doomed to repeat these cycles of history? Is that what we're learning today?
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff, right? Like, we look back at these regimes, at Hitler, at Castro, at all the terrible things they did, and it's easy to think, oh, that was then, this is now, we'd never let that happen again. But the scary part is, it's not always so obvious when it's happening.
Exactly. It's not like there's this big flashing sign that says, "Warning, authoritarianism in progress."
Right, it's more like I don't know, like a slow creep. Exactly. A gradual erosion of norms. People start making compromises, small at first, in the name of security, stability, and then one day you wake up and you're like, wait, how did we get here?
Yeah, and that's why I think understanding Linz's framework, like those 4 characteristics we talked about, it's so important. It's not about being paranoid or seeing dictators around every corner.
Right, no one wants to live like that.
But it's about being aware, informed, recognizing those early warning signs so we can call it out, push back before it's too late.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Yeah. Okay, so to bring it all home for today, our goal wasn't to give you a history lesson on Hitler and Castro. It was more about using their regimes, as different as they were, as case studies, examples of how authoritarianism can take root, and once it does, how quickly it can spread.
Right, like they're not the only ones, and they certainly won't be the last.
And that's the really unsettling part, isn't it? Like, we can point to those historical examples, but these patterns, these, I don't know, like these seductive whispers of authoritarianism, they're still very much present in the world today.
Oh, yeah. And it's easier than ever to get caught up in them with social media, the 24-hour news cycle, everyone's shouting. It's hard to know what to believe.
Exactly. So what do we do? As individuals, what can we do with this knowledge? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, that's just the way it is?
No way. We can't just give up. It's not about becoming historians or, political science professors overnight. It's about being engaged citizens, critical thinkers.
Right. Like, don't just take everything at face value.
Exactly. Question the narratives that are being presented to you. Demand transparency and accountability from your leaders. And this is a big one. Don't be afraid to speak out when you see injustice happening, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it might make you unpopular.
Because silence, history has taught us time and time again, silence only benefits the oppressors. So, on that note, as you go about your day, reading the news, scrolling through social media, I don't know, even just talking to your family and friends about politics, keep Linz's framework in mind, those 4 characteristics of authoritarianism. And ask yourself, do you see any of those patterns, those warning signs, reflected in the events happening around you? Because, like we were saying, recognizing the patterns, that's the first step towards breaking them.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the doom and gloom we have time for today, folks. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.